He built an empire around motion, beauty, and power, then stepped away from it while his name was still stamped on the machines. That is the tension at the center of E.L. Cord, a man who learned how to make the future look irresistible, and then spent the rest of his rise proving that the same instinct that creates spectacle can also create danger. By the time his name was known across Auburn, Duesenberg, and Cord, he was no longer just a car man. He had reach in engines, aircraft, taxis, and shipbuilding. For a stretch, his world looked bigger than the ordinary auto business. It looked like a private kingdom built out of steel, timing, style, and nerve. That is the version people remember, the polished version, the legendary version. But the real story is not about a man born into command. It is about someone who came up from the rough edge of the industry and learned very early that people do not just buy machinery. They buy confidence. They buy image. They buy the feeling that they are stepping into something ahead of everybody else. Let us go back to Missouri, because the beginning was much smaller than the ending suggests. Errett Laban Cord was born in Warrensburg in 1894, and almost nothing in that start points cleanly toward industrial glamour. He was not raised inside a powerful manufacturing family. He was not handed a platform. He did not enter the car world through polished offices and long-established connections. His early life moved through garages, used cars, dirt tracks, repair work, sales floors, and the kind of unstable hustle that teaches a person to think quickly or get left behind. He built racing bodies for worn Fords. He spent time around Tacoma's racing scene. He sold cars in Chicago. Those details sound scattered until you understand what they were doing to him. They were training his eye. They were sharpening his instinct. They were forcing him to live close to risk, rejection, improvisation, and appetite. I think that shaped almost everything that came later. A person raised inside order often learns to protect the machine. A person raised close to breakdown learns to read pressure. Cord did not grow into the business like a caretaker. He entered it like someone studying weakness in real time. He learned what people looked at, what they ignored, what made them hesitate, and what made them reach for their wallet. That kind of education does not come from theory. It comes from standing in front of somebody who is not convinced and finding a way to move them anyway. Here is why that feels so important. A lot of industrial success stories get told as if the winner had one clean gift from the beginning: engineering brilliance, financial discipline, some obvious superior talent. Cord's early pattern looks different. His gift was not neat, it was not academic. It was the ability to sense energy in a room and change it. He could spot desire before it was fully visible. He could feel when a product was being ignored not because it was worthless, but because it had been framed badly. That is a rare ability. It can build a fortune. It can also slowly distort the person who trusts it too much. Before the famous brands, before the empire, before the sleek lines and the grand reputation, you can already see the split forming. There is the hunger, which is real. There is the improvisation, which becomes power. But there is also the first crack under the surface. If you learn young that presentation can rescue weakness, you may start believing presentation can solve more than it really can. That is not a small flaw. That can become a whole way of life. And this is where the story starts to move. In 1924, Cord arrived at Auburn, a company that was struggling badly. Its cars were not selling. Its energy was gone. The place did not look like the entrance to a legendary rise. It looked tired. It looked stalled. It looked like one more company slipping toward irrelevance. Cord was given the chance to run it, and what he did next tells you almost everything about how his mind worked. He took unsold Auburn cars, improved their appearance with fresh paint and brighter trim, and sold them. That sounds almost too simple. But sit with it for a second. He did not begin by reinventing the engine. He did not begin with some grand industrial breakthrough. He began by changing how the car met the eye. He understood that people often respond to signal before substance. A machine can be decent and still fail if it feels old. A company can have usable products and still die if the public has stopped looking. Cord knew how to make them look again. That was the first true sign that something unusual was happening. Not because repainting cars is glamorous, it is not, but because it revealed the mind behind the move. He was already seeing the business on two levels at once. There was the mechanical level, which everyone in the industry respected. Then there was the psychological level, which many serious men underestimated. Cord saw both, and he understood that the second one could move the first. He could wake up inventory by waking up desire. He could shift attention, and once attention shifted, money could follow. That is not surface-level salesmanship. That is leverage. And once a man discovers leverage, he rarely becomes modest. But that is only the first layer. Because what looks like brilliance at the beginning can carry the seed of future collapse inside it. Auburn responded. Cord's confidence rose with it. He was learning that style could revive a stale company, that momentum could be created, that a dying room could be made to feel alive. Those are powerful lessons. They are also risky ones. When somebody learns early that energy can change reality, restraint starts to feel less interesting, patience starts to feel slow, limits begin to look negotiable. You can already feel the deeper pattern forming beneath the rise. Cord was not just trying to sell cars. He was learning how to command mood, signal strength, and turn image into force. He was learning that admiration does not always have to be earned step by step. Sometimes it can be triggered, then expanded, then organized into something bigger. That idea would open doors for him. It would also tempt him into thinking speed itself was a kind of solution. I do not think he saw Auburn as a final destination. I think he saw it as proof. Proof that he could enter a weak situation, read the hidden value, reshape the public's reaction, and get movement where everybody else saw drag. Once a person proves that to himself, the scale of ambition changes. One company stops feeling enough. One recovery stops feeling satisfying. The appetite grows. The vision widens. And from there, the road ahead gets more thrilling and more dangerous at the same time. Because Auburn was not simply a rescue. It was the opening signal of a much larger ambition. The company was waking up. Cord was gaining speed. And underneath that success, something harder was setting into place. A belief that momentum, image, and nerve could carry him through almost anything. For a while, that belief would look like genius. Then it would ask for a price. And the moment that price begins to take shape is the moment Cord stops looking like a gifted fixer and starts looking like something much more dangerous, a man building a system. Auburn had shown him that presentation could revive a weak company. What came next showed that he was thinking past one showroom, one factory, one brand. He became president of Auburn in 1924, acquired Duesenberg 2 years later, and by 1929 had pushed the Auburn concern into the Cord L29, the first widely sold front-wheel drive car in America. That alone would have been enough to make him unusual. But he did not stop there. He kept expanding outward, gathering companies and capabilities around him until the business was no longer just about making automobiles. It was about controlling motion, prestige, and production from several directions at once. The change in mindset is the real center of this part of the story. Early on, Cord looked like a sharp salesman with instinct. By the end of the 1920s, he had become something else, a strategist who understood that style becomes far more powerful when you own the machinery behind it. In June 1929, he formed Cord Corporation as a holding and operating company, and its holdings stretched far beyond one badge on a grill. They included Auburn, Lycoming, Checker Cab Manufacturing, New York Shipbuilding, Columbia Axle, LGS Devices, and other transportation interests, while sources tied his orbit to Stinson Aircraft and related aviation businesses as well. Taken one by one, those names can seem disconnected, but they were not disconnected in Cord's mind. He was assembling leverage. I think that is what most people miss when they look back at him. They see the glamour first. They see the spectacular cars, the polished name, the drama of the rise. What they miss is the architecture underneath. Cord was not simply trying to sell beautiful machines. He was trying to create a world in which engineering, styling, publicity, and ownership fed each other. A flashy car could attract attention. A cluster of companies could turn that attention into force. That is a very different game. It is not about one good product. It is about building an ecosystem where the products, the parts, the image, and the reach all strengthen each other. That is where he begins to separate from ordinary ambition. And you can feel that separation in the kind of cars that came out of his orbit. The L29 was already bold because front-wheel drive was still a radical choice for an American passenger car. Auburn had even purchased the right to use Harry Miller's front drive designs and patents, which shows that Cord was not waiting around for the industry to hand him the future. He was willing to reach for ideas that others considered too experimental, then turn them into products with status attached. That combination is important. Plenty of people chase innovation. Far fewer know how to make innovation feel desirable before the wider public fully trusts it. Cord could do that. He could take a technical decision and make it signal modernity. Because this was never just about mechanics. It was about theater with substance under it. Cord did not have to be the most gifted engineer in the room. He needed to gather the right people, place them inside a structure he controlled, and make the result feel inevitable. That is why the Duesenberg connection was so valuable. Britannica notes that Fred and August Duesenberg designed the Model J and other outstanding cars for him after he acquired their company. That tells you a lot. Cord's brilliance was not that he personally designed every breakthrough. His brilliance was that he could spot rare talent, own the platform, and turn excellence into a larger story people wanted to join. Then came the clearest expression of that ability, the Cord 810. When it appeared at the 1935 auto shows, it did not merely look new. It looked like it had arrived from somewhere ahead of its own decade. The press gave it disproportionate space. Crowds packed around it in New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago. According to the National Park Service record, color brochures vanished quickly, and the factory received more than 7,000 inquiries. People literally stood on the running boards and bumpers of competing cars to get a better look. That kind of reaction does not happen because a company has decent specifications. It happens because a machine has crossed over into image, mood, and desire. But that is only the first layer. The same record that captures the excitement also captures the strain. Auburn had committed itself to showing 100 cars, yet not all of them were ready. As the date closed in, only 25 went to the shows, and those cars did not even have transmissions installed because testing was still continuing. Employees in Auburn and Connorsville were working 60 to 70-hour weeks trying to finish prototypes while the Depression still weighed on the country. Read that closely, and the deeper truth comes into view. The applause was real. The innovation was real. The pressure was real too. Cord's world was producing wonder under brutal conditions. That is where the rise starts to carry a different emotional texture. It is no longer only the story of a hungry outsider proving he belongs. It becomes the story of a man who has built a machine that demands constant force to keep its shape. Cord's genius was speed, but speed creates exposure. The faster you expand, the more fragile your timing becomes. The more dazzling the launch, the harsher the consequences when execution slips. Even the National Park Service description of the 810 calls it a remarkable accomplishment produced under horrendous pressures of time and economics. That phrase tells the truth in plain language. The brilliance was genuine. So was the instability. And while the public saw a symbol of tomorrow, the ground under the business was already shifting. Auburn's dealer network, which Cord had assembled in the 1920s, began shrinking rapidly after its peak in 1931. By 1935, only 499 Auburn dealers remained in the United States, and nearly half of them also carried other makes. That detail may sound dry, but it says something hard. The brand could still command attention, yet the support structure beneath it was thinning. This is how strain often enters a rise like this. Not with one loud collapse, but with weakening support under a glittering surface. The crowd still stares at the stage. The beams behind the stage begin to bend. I think Cord sensed that pressure and pushed even harder, because pushing harder had worked before. That is the trap inside his style of success. When motion has saved you once, and then again, it becomes tempting to believe motion itself is the answer. Expand wider, launch bigger, move faster than doubt. He had built an empire by turning attention into leverage, and for a while that looked like a higher form of intelligence. In many ways, it was. But every system built on momentum eventually reaches the point where momentum stops hiding the weaknesses and starts amplifying them. Cord was climbing higher. His name was brighter. His companies looked larger than life. Yet the engine of the rise was beginning to show its other face. The same instinct that let him bend the future toward himself was also loading more weight onto a structure that had to be perfect just to hold. And once that kind of pressure builds, the story does not stay about beauty for long. It starts moving toward exposure. And once exposure begins, money stops being clean proof that a man was right. It starts becoming a test of what exactly he built and what can survive when the shine no longer hides the strain. That is where E.L. Cord's story turns from dazzling to difficult. By the middle of the 1930s, he had become one of the most recognizable names in American transportation. He had prestige, reach, influence, and products that looked years ahead of their time. But the same system that made him look untouchable was already splitting into two realities. One reality was public. Crowds, headlines, sleek designs, the feeling that his companies were inventing tomorrow in real time. The other was harder and quieter. Losses, shrinking room to maneuver, dealers under pressure, luxury buyers fading, and a manufacturing world that could not run forever on admiration alone. Auburn had already stopped making money. The Cord was admired, but it never sold in great enough numbers to keep Auburn Automobile Company alive for the long term. The cars were being pushed into the market at prices that showed how ugly the economics had become. And by the summer of 1937, Cord's own advisors told him there was no hope of making a profit from Auburn, Cord, or Duesenberg. The company went out of business that summer, and Auburn Automobile Company went into bankruptcy in the spring of 1938. Britannica sums up the end in one blunt line. Because of the Depression, manufacture of Auburns, Cords, and Duesenbergs ceased in 1937. Here is the bitter truth. The machines were still beautiful when the structure around them was failing. The public could still be amazed. That was never the whole problem. The deeper problem was that Cord had built a world where speed, style, expansion, and confidence were doing too much of the lifting. When those forces begin to weaken, the bill arrives all at once. And in Cord's case, the pressure was not only financial. In 1934, he took his second wife and their children to England to escape kidnapping threats. While he was away, rumors moved through Wall Street that the man who had wisely avoided disaster in 1929 had started trading more aggressively and had gotten burned. After returning to the United States, he drew the attention of the Securities and Exchange Commission because of heavy trading in checker cab stock. Then came a detail that tells you more than the grander headlines do. Time reported that in April 1937, Cord went to a Chicago hospital for a needed rest. A few months later, just after turning 43, he consented to a federal court order barring further violations of SEC anti-manipulation provisions while denying the charge, and at the same time announced the sale of his entire holdings in Cord Corporation to a Manhattan banking group for $2,000. I want to pause on that for a second because this is where a lot of people misread the ending. He did not collapse into poverty. He did not die broke in the ruins of his empire. In strictly financial terms, the picture was more complicated and, in some ways, more impressive. A Nevada Supreme Court opinion later described his wealth in 1937 as about $8 million and said that by the time he died in 1974, the value of his estate had increased almost fivefold. PBS, drawing on the later record of his life, put the estate he left to his family and foundation at an estimated $39 million, so the man did not lose his ability to make money. Not even close. He kept it. He multiplied it, and that is what makes the ending more haunting, not less. Cord did not fail in the simple way people expect from stories like this. He lost the kingdom that carried his public image, then went on making millions elsewhere. The transportation empire that made him famous was not the final container of his wealth. After the auto age closed around him, he moved into other fields. PBS describes him buying valuable land on Wilshire Boulevard, starting radio stations in Los Angeles, buying television stations, investing in mines and Western property, and later serving as a Nevada state senator. In other words, the instinct was still there. The eye for leverage did not disappear. He remained what he had always been, a man who could see opportunity before it looked obvious to everyone else. But success outside the auto world does not erase what happened inside it. I think that is where the emotional truth lives. The wound from the beginning was never only about money. It was about motion. It was about proving that he could enter unstable ground, take hold of it, and force it into life. That hunger built the rise. It also followed him into every decision that made the rise harder to control. A person who learns early that speed can rescue him often keeps trusting speed long after it has become dangerous. A person who survives by instinct often struggles to believe in limits. That is not a flaw you simply outgrow because the bank account gets bigger. In Cord's case, wealth may have outlived the auto collapse, but the original pattern stayed the same. He kept moving. He kept building. He kept turning foresight into advantage. The price was that the public empire attached to his name could not hold together under the force of the very instincts that created it. And this is where the story becomes larger than one executive or one brand. Cord's rise was never just about cars. It was about how image, engineering, timing, and ownership can be fused into something so powerful that it briefly feels invincible. The same talent that let him revive Auburn, acquire Duesenberg, push front-wheel drive into the American market, and unveil the astonishing 810 also encouraged him to trust motion over stability. He could see the future. What he could not fully do was slow down enough to build a structure equal to the speed of his own vision. That is not a moral failure in the cartoon sense. It is more human than that. It is the old story of a strength becoming too dominant to control the life built around it. Still, this is not a story that ends in emptiness. The company died. The cars did not. PBS calls the Cord a phenomenal car and says it earned a lasting reputation long after the business was gone. That says a lot. The books turned ugly, but the design remained. The factories closed, but the symbols survived. That is a strange kind of victory. Not financial, because he already had that elsewhere. Not corporate, because the corporate structure broke. It is something harder to define and harder to dismiss. He made machines that outlived the collapse around them. He built objects so strong in form, ambition, and presence that they kept speaking long after the organization behind them fell silent. So when you look back at E.L. Cord, I do not think the final lesson is that brilliance leads to ruin or that ambition always destroys itself. It is more interesting than that. He came from the rough side of the business and learned to read hunger with unusual precision. He understood that people wanted not only transportation, but status, movement, and the sensation of stepping into the future before their neighbors did. He turned that understanding into an empire. Then the same drive that gave the empire its force also made it difficult to hold together. He left the auto world with money, but not with the kingdom that had made his name glow. And yet the name stayed alive anyway, because what he built at his best carried more than commerce inside it. It carried imagination. In the end, that may be the clearest way to see him. Not as a man who simply won or lost, but as a man from an unlikely beginning who turned instinct into power, power into beauty, and beauty into something that lasted longer than the structure that first paid for it.